A Pan-Asian baseball league is an idea that gets floated around from time to time. Most recently, it was suggested by Don Nomura last month during an online event called Chatter Up, hosted by Japan Ball. In case you don't know, Don Nomura is an agent who's represented players such as Hideo Nomo, Alfonso Soriano, Yu Darvish, Kenta Maeda, among many others, and he is the one responsible for enabling them to jump from NPB to MLB. He is the adopted son of legendary Japanese manager Katsuya Nomura. His idea is for Japan, along with Korea, Taiwan, and China, to form an Asian major league. He also suggests removing the quota for foreign players and importing more of them to create more balance between Asia and MLB, so they can one day hold a true World Series. It's not the first time I've heard this idea. About 10 years ago, a previous NPB commissioner had talked about a Pan-Asian league, combining the teams of NPB, KBO, and CPBL, and putting a few expansion teams on the east coast of China to bring the total number of teams up to 30, thus equaling MLB in size. But could this work? There are many different ways they could go about doing this, and I plan on covering them all here today. I'll discuss the benefits and drawbacks of a Pan-Asian league and offer a few alternatives and variations to what Mr. Nomura proposes. And I'll let you decide if any of them are reasonable. Let us know in the comments. Okay, so why would they want a Pan-Asian league? Aside from the growth of the leagues, which I've already mentioned, it would also help fans in the four countries to become more aware of each other. A typical baseball fan in Japan knows very little about the KBO, even less about the CPBL, and absolutely nothing about baseball in China. As a unified Asian league, they would learn more about each other, the teams, the players, the stadiums. Travel between the countries among baseball fans would increase, and this might be a way for baseball to finally break into the Chinese market. The Chinese have shown very little interest in their own professional baseball league, but if they were to be part of a large, high-level international league, it might actually spark some interest. Travel times would not be a big deal since the area covered would be much smaller than the United States. Now, how would they go about doing this? One way is to just take the teams as they are and throw them together. This would be the easiest way to do it. Teams could just go about their usual business, only with some different opponents and more traveling. The problem is the difference in talent. If they were all thrown into a single league right now, the NPB teams would dominate, CPBL teams would never make the postseason, and the Chinese teams may never win a game against any of the other three leagues. So another option is to allow the talent to flow from team to team, regardless of country. The Hanshin Tigers and Hanwha Eagles could make a trade. An NC Dinos pitcher could leave as a free agent and sign with the Fubon Guardians. This way every team would have access to the top players in Asia. But having access to the players doesn't mean they've got the money for them. A wealth disparity exists between ball clubs in every professional league, and the wealthier teams usually win more because of it. But the difference in wealth between the Asian leagues is so big that it would allow the richest teams in Japan to lure away the top players from Korea and Taiwan, and the talent difference would grow even larger. So, measures would need to be taken to ensure that the spending power of teams becomes more balanced, even if they're not perfectly equal, which would never happen. That would be difficult to do, if not impossible. But let's say they make it work and all 30 Asian teams are capable of signing star players and making a postseason run every few years. Now you risk alienating the Japanese fan base, who would see their on-field product watered down. Some of their top players would be playing in other countries, and players who wouldn't even make the roster for a current NPB team would be starting members for teams in the Pan-Asian League. Nomura addresses this problem when he calls for the restriction on foreign players to be lifted. This would mean that teams could sign more talented players from the US, Dominican Republic, or wherever, instead of relying on less talented players to fill the roster. The result would be a very international league, looking more like MLB than an Asian league. It really would be an MLB of the East. Players would be crossing the Pacific more in both directions. Asian teams would start competing with MLB teams for players, and the possibility of becoming the world's top professional baseball league could become realistic. But is this what the countries involved really want? In this hypothetical league, Japanese and Korean teams would look a lot less Japanese and Korean. Taiwanese teams would have very few native Taiwanese players, and the Chinese teams would be completely made up of foreign players. Their teams would have more talent, but they'd be harder to identify with. No matter how you try to put this league together, you run into some kind of problem, but there are a few alternatives. One is to remove China from the discussion. That's an obvious one. It's not a baseball country. Their league is way behind the other three. If they're so intent on spreading the game to China, it would be better to start without them, and later add a Chinese expansion team. I mean much later. And while we're heading in that direction, it might make sense to leave out the CPBL too. They've got some talented players, and their league is a lot of fun to watch, but they just aren't close enough to the other two in talent or money. If you narrow it down to just Korean and Japanese teams, it starts to look more realistic. The talent gap is not so big. 6-figure salaries are common in both leagues, 7 figures for the top players. This united Japanese-Korean league would be split into two western and eastern halves. For familiarity's sake, we'd call the western half the KBO, and the eastern half the NPB. The two league championship series would be called the Korea Series and the Japan Series, and the winners could meet in the Asia Series. During the regular season, some interleague could go on. Actually, it kind of sounds like they'd just be keeping the league separate and reviving the Asia Series, something I talked about in last Friday's video. But the interleague idea is a new one. Even if the leagues don't join together, they could still schedule some interleague play every year. The CPBL could be included here too. Make it a pair of 3-game series, one against each league, one at home and one on the road. This would give each league's fans some exposure to the other leagues, and it wouldn't prolong the season. They can just add it in the middle. Asian Interleague Week could become a big annual event. There is one more option, and it's very likely the most popular one. That is, keep things the way they are. Separate leagues, separate championships. Mostly domestic players with a few imports on each team. After all, the leagues put a good product on the field that the fans seem to like, so why ruin a good thing? Alright, I threw out a lot of ideas on how to make this work, so let me run through those one more time quickly. Then you be the judge. Leave a comment telling us which one you agree with, or if you have your own idea. 1. Throw the teams together and have them play as they are. 2. Put the leagues together and allow players to move from one country to another with some control on spending. 3. All 4 countries together, spending somewhat balanced and no restriction on the number of foreign players. 4. Same as number 3 but with no Chinese teams. 5. Same as number 4 but with no CPBL either. 6. No integration but have interleague play. 7. Leave everything as it is. And that's all for this one. Until next time, this is Baseball International. See ya.